Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
I never went camping much as a kid, so when one of my work buddies, Sam, invited me on a camping trip he planned with his cousin Matthew, I was excited to do it again as an adult. Sam and I had become pretty good friends at work, so I thought it would be a great opportunity to hang out for a weekend. He and Matthew spend a lot of time outdoors, and one of their favorite camping spots is on the beach near an old lighthouse. I don't usually meet my friends' family, so I took this opportunity to be more outgoing and try to make a new friend in the process. He told me they camp on the beach at Jubilee Cove every year, so I had high expectations by the time the first day of the trip came around. Sam asked that I bring my own tent and sleeping bag and said I could ride with him to the beach, while Matthew would meet up with us later that day since he was driving separately after he got off an early shift at work. The drive to Jubilee Cove took us about 70 miles northeast, and we got there in the late afternoon. When we arrived, I was glad to see that the beach wasn't crowded like the beaches that I'm used to visiting, so I would have a decent opportunity to really relax. We set up our tents on the beach, being sure not to set up too close to the shoreline. After setting up, we ate a couple of the sandwiches we packed in a cooler and sat back, enjoying the sound of the crashing waves and seagulls looking for the perfect chance to swoop in for a bit of food. Off in the distance, I saw the lighthouse overlooking the area. I figured it must have been ages since someone had been inside it based on the visibly cracked windows and the exterior missing pieces of stone here and there. Despite the lighthouse seeming abandoned, I thought I saw movement toward the top of the inside of the lighthouse. But I figured I must have been imagining things when I saw a seagull fly away from the same area outside the lighthouse. I remembered that we were still waiting on Matthew after settling in for about an hour, so I asked Sam if everything was all right with Matthew. He had been texting Matthew while we were eating and said he had run into some issues with his truck, but that he should meet us at the beach soon. We sat around talking and waiting for Matthew at the campsite for another hour or so, watched the sunset, and decided we should probably settle in for the night a little after it got dark. Between our tents, we had started a fire in a fire pit, and we decided to keep it burning in case Matthew arrived while we were still awake. We left a large gap between our tents so that Matthew could set up his own between them once he arrived, and Sam said he would keep his eye on the campfire while he waited up a bit longer. Since he was on campfire duty, I took the opportunity to head to my tent, change my clothes, and relax before our full day camping at the beach the next morning. I don't remember falling asleep, but woke up suddenly with the feeling someone was watching me. There was nothing I could see through the dark, but felt like I saw something move behind my tent. At first, I panicked, thinking maybe there was some sort of animal nearby, but soon realized Matthew might have finally arrived. I waited and listened to hear if any of the noises would continue, but they had stopped after I woke up. No matter though, I was wide awake now. I unzipped the tent flap and looked outside. Nothing. The sky was still mostly black, but I could tell it had grown somewhat lighter since we went to bed. I switched my flashlight on and looked around again, trying to figure out where I might have seen movement. Then I heard the sound of footsteps approaching in the sand. I swung my head around to look, but there was nothing. I listened for more sounds, and the sound of the footsteps continued. I turned my light back toward the path leading to our tents. Someone with a flashlight was walking down the path slowly, as if lost or searching for something. I watched him approach, and as he drew closer, I saw a man who looked about Sam's height, but with dark hair, unlike Sam's dirty blonde hair. His face lit up when he saw mine, and he waved excitedly. He then walked over to the fire pit and picked up a stick. He threw it into the fire, leaving the glowing embers burning brightly. "Hey, sorry to get here so late. Car trouble. I'm Matthew." He reached his right hand out for a handshake, his left hand pointing the flashlight uncomfortably toward my face. "Oh, hey, I began before he cut me off when he realized he was shining the flashlight right at my eyes. "Sorry, I didn't mean to blind you." "No worries," I replied. I awkwardly shook his hand as he lowered the flashlight, not realizing that I forgot to finish introducing myself. "How was the drive over here? You're a braver man than me driving out here in the middle of the night," I said. "Oh, not too bad. I've been down here tons of times. I could practically drive here in the dark. He set down a backpack that had been slung over his right shoulder, and I noticed a cut on the back of his left hand. It seemed like it was probably somewhat fresh when his flashlight illuminated it while switching from one hand to the other. That looks like it hurts. Do you have anything to cover that up? I can check my bag if you need a bandage or something, I said. Oh, no, this just happened while I was dealing with the car issue that made me so late. I've tinkered with cars before, but I'm no expert, as you can probably guess by how late it is. Matthew approached the fire pit between my tent and Sam's, bent down next to me, and whispered, "Look." I followed his gaze towards the rising smoke. In the distance, I could see a light, growing brighter as Matthew pointed it out. I hadn't noticed it before, but there was a faint light coming from inside the lighthouse. Matthew lifted his finger to his lips and moved his eyes to look in different directions. He motioned to follow him. I nodded and followed cautiously. Matthew led me through a path right off the beach toward the lighthouse, flashlight in hand. We approached the lighthouse, and seeing it up close only exacerbated how ancient it looked after being abandoned. We walked inside and saw a rickety staircase, which Matthew climbed first. I followed after, reaching the top and looking back down the way we came. From this height, the lighthouse stood tall and powerful, as if protecting the small town it belonged to. Matthew looked out one of the windows and sat on the inner ledge below it. "What are you doing?" I asked. Matthew put his hands behind his head and leaned back, stretching out. "This is the best view I've ever seen," he said, smiling. "You sure this isn't dangerous? You know, you could fall or get trapped in here. You never know what could happen." "There's nothing to worry about, man. This place is perfectly safe. Come here, have a seat. I'll show you." I climbed up to join Matthew, being careful not to slip off the edge. We sat there silently for several minutes, enjoying the breeze coming through cracks in the windows. After a while, Matthew turned to me and looked at me intently, almost quizzically. "Have you ever wondered what happened to your family? How they disappeared, I guess I should say. Your father told me. He tells me everything about the accident. Of course, I didn't believe him at first, but now I do. It makes sense. Why shouldn't it make sense? I don't understand how anyone could think otherwise." I looked at him with an obvious look of disbelief. After all, this comment came out of nowhere, and as far as I knew, my family was completely fine. I sat dumbfounded, unable to respond before he added nervously, "Well, you know, I thought about asking you on our way up here, but I figured it would be weird to bring up such a heavy topic while we were just getting to know one another. I always feel awkward when I ask questions like that." "Matthew," I replied, "I don't know where any of this is coming from. My family is fine. What are you talking about?" "Oh, come on, what do you think? I can see it in your face. Everyone wants to talk about their family history, especially when they're away from home. I bet you guys used to spend hours telling stories about each other." "You're starting to freak me out," I replied, trying to figure out the distance between us so that I could calculate my chances of being able to escape if this conversation became any more unusual or morbid. We stared at one another for a moment, both unsure of what to say. Matthew broke the silence by saying, "Hey, I was wondering, do you mind if I sleep here tonight?" "Knock yourself out, man," I replied, thankful that he might sleep anywhere other than near my tent. I sat for a moment trying to understand what he was getting at, but was relieved that he seemed to have dropped the topic of my family. "Why do you want to sleep up here anyway? Isn't it dangerous?" "It's supposed to be. That's why it makes a great lookout, and besides, there will only be 2 of us." I began to nod, but stopped myself. "2 of us?" I asked. "Yeah, just me and you, buddy. There won't be anyone else up here since everyone else is asleep. That's part of the fun of camping, right?" "What do you mean by everyone else?" "Sam is the only other person camping with us, and he's down at the campsite." "Yeah, that's what I meant. Do you mind if I tell you something he told me? Something he probably wouldn't want you to hear? Just promise not to repeat anything." He paused, looking intently into my eyes. For a moment, I thought he might be going to ask me another question, but instead, he continued. Sam said that you know exactly what this place is. You know the significance of this location. You know better than anybody. But you also know that Sam is scared of it. And you don't care because you're not afraid anymore. I was so stunned by the overconfidence in his voice that I couldn't reply. You see, this place is special because it holds the secret to your family's disappearance. The reason you're here. It's a very strange story, isn't it? Not too many people get to go back to their childhood home as adults and discover the truth behind this sort of thing. Matthew, I interrupted. I have no idea what you're talking about. First, you said it was an accident, and then you said this lighthouse has something to do with it. You've got to realize nothing about what you're saying makes sense. It makes perfect sense to me. I was telling you the truth earlier. When Sam told me about this camping trip, I started to wonder if the place really held some kind of meaning for your family. Then I realized that the lighthouse is almost directly over the spot where the accident happened. So I looked it up online and found that you did live nearby, at least until you were 6 years old. By this point, I had come up with 3 or 4 ways I could get out of this situation. So I tried to pick the one that would make it less likely for him to follow me or realize I was trying to escape. Well, my family is fine. I've never even visited this beach before, so Sam must have had me mixed up with someone else. I paused, initiating my exit plan. Hey, Matt. I'm gonna head back to the campsite to grab something to make myself comfortable up here. Do you need anything while I'm down there? No, I've got everything I need up here. Don't you? As I began walking down the staircase, the awkward silence felt threatening. I turned and saw him staring straight at me with his brow furrowed, and I swear I could have felt his gaze pierce right through me. It's Matthew, not Matt. It felt like a lump had hardened in my throat, leaving it with a dryness that made it hard to speak. Sorry, man. I'll be right back, I said, beginning to make my way down the staircase. Hey, wait, I didn't say anything wrong, did I? It was my mistake. I wasn't thinking. Please, I don't want you to leave. You can stay here. It's cool with me. I'm not going anywhere. I continued to walk down the stairs, taking each step carefully. He followed closely behind me, making sure not to let me get too far ahead. I don't think I can risk staying here tonight after all. You're right. This is just too dangerous, he said, following close behind and crashing each of my exit plans. I tried to come up with something to say to keep him in the lighthouse and thought it would help if I said something validating about what I had rejected as too dangerous just moments earlier. I should probably go now, I said. I mean, I've got to get back to the campsite and get ready for tomorrow. If you'd rather not come, I understand. The view is great up here. I continued walking down the staircase, hoping that he would stop and stay behind, but he continued following me down. What are you doing? You can't leave me here alone. This place isn't safe. I know it. There's something very strange about this whole thing. I'm serious. Something very bad could happen to me, he said. About halfway down the staircase, I looked behind me and saw Matthew hop onto another ledge with one of the visibly cracked windows, and assumed he reconsidered following me. But what happened next made me double take. Matthew punched a hole through the window and stuck his head out, looking left and right, pulling his head back inside the lighthouse. He looked back at me, chuckling and playfully grinning, as though he hadn't just destroyed part of this lighthouse. Race you down? See ya, he said, propelling himself through the broken window that must have been at least 100 feet off the ground. In an instant, he disappeared from view. I took a deep breath, quickly made my way down the rest of the staircase, and began to run toward the beach where I hoped to find help. But as I rounded the corner of the lighthouse, a hand shot out and grabbed me around the shoulder. Wait up, let me take you back to the campsite. I'm sure they're worried sick about you. Why are you running? Matthew ran to the edge of a nearby dock and stopped, pointing to the top of the lighthouse tower. Let me show you something really cool. Come up here and bring your phone. There are some great views up here. I'm good. You go without me, I replied. I wasn't asking, said Matthew, approaching me menacingly from the end of the dock. I knew I had to do something, so I turned and ran toward the campground, torn between wanting to hide from him and wanting to cry out for Sam to help me. It was still dark outside, but I could tell that the darkness would soon come to an end, and if I was going to hide, I needed to be as far away from him as I could before sunrise. I made a sudden 90-degree turn away from the campsite to look for a spot where Matthew wouldn't see me. I had only gone about 50 yards when he called out, "Hey, wait! Where are you going?" I kept quiet, continuing to head away from the campground, hoping I might find something left behind by other beachgoers that I could use to cover myself. I had no idea whether he saw me or not, and I did my best to keep my stride steady. "Where are you going? Come back here!" he shouted again, coming closer with each call. His voice seemed to echo throughout the area, causing me to slow my pace even more to avoid being heard. I turned around to walk backwards so I could keep my eyes on Matthew, if I could see him at all, while looking for any shelter I could find. This probably wasn't the best idea, as I had found myself on the sand dunes, and every step I took was on ground even more uneven than the last. Despite my attempts to keep track of Matthew, I lost him when I looked down to help prevent myself from falling, and after only a few seconds, I also failed that attempt too. I suddenly fell on my back, wondering if Matthew had somehow eluded me and grabbed me, and when I looked up, I realized I had fallen down the side of a sand dune near a few large patches of tall beach grass. I pushed myself up and knelt next to one of the patches of beach grass and surveyed my surroundings. Off in the distance, I could see the flickering fire of the fire pit, and the glow of the fire provided enough light for me to see Matthew, who was walking toward the campsite as quickly as he could through the thick sand. Not wanting to make my location known, I kept my mouth shut and tried to slow my breathing. I began to fear for Sam, but tried calming myself down, remembering people often get used to the odd things their family members do. I had brought my phone with me and thought about calling Sam, but didn't want Matthew to know I was calling, so I chose to wait and hope that Matthew's behavior was either an elaborate joke or something that wouldn't put Sam at risk. I did a quick check of what I had on me and realized all I had other than my phone was what I was wearing, now soaked with sweat. From a distance, I watched Matthew approach the fire pit, grab his bag, and throw it over his shoulder, and saw that he seemed to be trying to cover and soothe the wound on his hand that I noticed when I first met him. He turned off his flashlight and slowly approached Sam's tent. He seemed to inspect the tent for any nets or flaps he could peer into, but after a few moments, he slowly backed away from Sam's tent, maybe about 10 to 15 feet, before sprinting through the thick sand, away from the campsite, and more importantly, in that moment, away from me. I decided to lie low until I saw daylight, and when I was confident that Matthew still wasn't around, I would meet Sam at the campsite. I found myself nestled up against a slight depression in the sand, and the stress of running away quickly manifested itself as exhaustion. I did my best not to fall asleep, but I reasoned that the beach grass and the curves and depressions of the sand dunes might shield me until sunrise, and I gradually allowed myself to fall asleep, listening to the waves crashing on the shore. I slept for at least 2 or 3 hours, and as the darkness shifted into morning light, I was awakened by the cries of seagulls and the voices of beachgoers who arrived early enough to see the sunrise over the water. I thought I might have heard the sound of heavy footsteps in the sand nearby, but was relieved to see 2 men walking with their fishing equipment toward the dock near the lighthouse. I laid my head back down and felt relieved, knowing that there were people around other than Sam and Matthew. Over the next half hour, as I was waking up and replaying the previous night's events in my mind, I watched as families approached the beach with their bags and folding chairs. I stood up and began walking toward the campsite, my legs sore from running through the sand. When I arrived, I found Sam sitting in a folding chair, one leg propped up on the other, scrolling through his phone and drinking coffee from a travel mug. "Early morning, huh?" he asked. "Yeah, I guess you could say that," I replied. "It looks like you went out for a run. It's awesome going out this early on the beach, right?" I looked around to see if Matthew was with Sam, but I couldn't see anyone around other than the people who had set up their chairs a few hundred yards away from us. "Hey, have you seen Matthew?" I asked. Sam looked confused and replied, "No, why do you ask?" I looked around for any sign of the belongings he had been carrying when I first saw him, but there was nothing around other than what Sam and I brought. "Anyway, man, you don't have to call him Matthew. Just call him Matt when you meet him. Everyone else does." "He didn't say he stopped by the campsite last night?" I asked. Sam looked puzzled again and began scanning the area around us. "No, he sent me a text saying he would be here this morning. He was working on his truck when this weird guy came up and started talking to him. They ended up talking about how he was going to the beach, and the guy completely flipped out on Matt. They ended up getting into a fight, and right when he was about to call the police, this weirdo just ran off. He decided to just call it a day and pick up again this morning." As he was talking, I slowly lost focus of what he was saying while my mind raced, wondering who it was that took me up to the lighthouse the night before. If this was some cruel joke between cousins, it didn't seem funny to me. As I came back to my senses, I realized Sam was staring at me, and that I had completely zoned out while I was trying to piece together what had happened. Just then, I heard the sound of a truck's engine approaching the beach, and saw Sam quickly turn around, approach the truck, and ask me to come with him. He caught up with the truck, spoke to the driver, and pointed toward the campsite. The driver's hair was a dark shade of blonde, and he had a short beard similar to Sam's. He raised a hand to greet me from behind the steering wheel, and I responded in kind. I turned away and walked toward my tent to check on the things I had brought with me since I had slept out in the dunes, but nothing seemed out of place. Nevertheless, in that moment, I couldn't wait to come up with an excuse to go back home early. And I knew I would need to be more tactful than when I tried to get out of the lighthouse alone the night before. As I walked out of the tent, I properly met the driver of the truck, who is now bringing camping equipment out of his truck bed onto the campsite. He introduced himself as Matthew, but said I could call him Matt. Unlike the person I had met the night before, Matt shared the same sociable demeanor as Sam, and seemed to be put off by my hesitance to say much after he arrived. I excused myself to rest, since Sam was already under the impression that I had just come back from a morning run, and sat in one of the folding chairs around the previously smoldering fire pit. As I looked off in the distance toward the lighthouse, I saw the previously cracked window was now completely shattered, just as I had witnessed happening the night before. I looked beyond the lighthouse toward the shimmering blue horizon and noticed sailboats not too far away. The sound of the crashing waves was punctuated by seagull calls, and I felt myself begin to relax and melt into the environment around me. I had fallen asleep once again, this time in the safety of the campsite, surrounded by at least one familiar face, but was jostled awake when Sam put his hand on my left shoulder and gently shook it. I opened my eyes and noticed a small crowd gathering around the base of the lighthouse, pointing up toward the shattered window, seeming to have a lively discussion about what happened to the lighthouse. I stood up to give Sam my full attention. A man and a woman were walking away from us toward the crowd at the lighthouse after speaking with Sam and Matt, and I realized the previous night's events were now the focus of everyone gathered nearby on the beach. Sam looked at me and back up to the lighthouse, focusing on the broken window while shielding his eyes from the sun, and said, "I talked to some of the people down there by the lighthouse. One of the girls camping nearby said she heard a window shattering in the middle of the night and could have sworn she saw someone being chased before both of the guys disappeared. You didn't hear anything, did you?"